On the very day she thought her life was about to bloom, the people she loved most sharpened their knives and aimed them straight at her heart. Grace, a 50-year-old nurse at Unity Hospital in Mapalo Town, had spent the whole week planning a special Mother's Day lunch. She polished her best china, ironed her cream-lace tablecloth, and filled the air with the aroma of goat stew slow-cooked in herbs and homemade bread rolls cooling on the counter. The sun streamed through her kitchen window, casting a golden glow on the home she had built with patience and sacrifice. She believed this day would be about gratitude, laughter, and love. But as the chairs filled and the conversations warmed, unseen storms were already gathering in the hearts of those seated at her table. Where are you watching from today? Kindly hit like, comment, and subscribe to this channel for more. Grace's small sitting room was alive with chatter. Her daughter Ruth, 28, arrived in a flowing yellow dress, her hair styled in neat cornrows, gold bangles clinking on her wrist. Her son Emmanuel, 32, wore a sharp navy suit and carried a leather folder as if coming from an important meeting. Even neighbors dropped by with greetings and small gifts of fruit. Grace's heart swelled at the sight of them all, for family had always been her greatest treasure. Lunch was served under the jacaranda tree in her yard, purple blossoms falling softly onto the table like nature's own confetti. The goat stew was rich, the bread warm, and the air sweet with roasted plantain. Laughter bubbled up between mouthfuls, and Grace found herself watching each face, memorizing the joy she saw there. But beneath the polite smiles, some eyes held something sharper, something she could not yet name. After the meal, Emmanuel tapped his glass and said, "Mama, Ruth and I want to give you something special this year." Ruth reached into her bag and pulled out a bright envelope. Inside was a single ticket for the national mega draw. "It's just for fun," Ruth laughed, placing it on the table. "Who knows, maybe you'll be a millionaire next week." Everyone chuckled, and the moment passed as quickly as it came. Grace slipped the ticket under a fridge magnet when clearing the dishes, thinking no more of it. But as the day faded and guests began to leave, Ruth and Emmanuel lingered in the kitchen. Grace overheard them whispering, their voices low and tight. She caught fragments. "Agreement, if she wins. Our share." A strange chill ran down her spine. She dismissed it, telling herself they were only joking. Yet deep in her chest, an old mother's instinct stirred like a bird waking in the night, sensing the wind had changed. 3 days later, Grace was finishing her night shift at Unity Hospital when her colleague Zanil, a cheerful nurse with a love for gossip, burst into the staff room. "Eesh, Grace, you won't believe this. Someone in Mapalo Town has won the national mega draw. 10 million rand. Grace laughed, shaking her head. "Ah, may they enjoy it," she said, not thinking much of it. But when Zanil showed her the winning numbers on her phone, something strange happened. They looked very familiar. Grace hurried home after her shift, her heart thumping. She went straight to the fridge, pulled out the ticket and compared the numbers. Every single one matched. For a long moment she just stood there, staring at the paper, her hands trembling. She had just become a millionaire. Her first thought was of paying off her mortgage, helping her church, and starting the small health clinic she had always dreamed about. But before she could even sit down, there was a knock at the door. Ruth and Emmanuel stood there, their smiles wide but their eyes calculating. Emmanuel didn't waste time. "Mama, congratulations. We heard the news. Now, remember our agreement. Half of the money belongs to us." Grace blinked, confused. "Agreement? What agreement?" Ruth stepped forward, her tone firm. "Mama, we gave you that ticket. We said if you win, you'll share half. We've already told people." Grace felt the air leave her lungs. "But you gave it as a gift," she said softly. Emmanuel shrugged. "Call it what you want, Mama, but if you don't give us our share, things will get complicated." It was then Grace saw it clearly. The ticket had never been a gift. It had been a trap, a gamble they hoped would pay off. And now that it had, they were ready to tear her apart to get what they wanted. As she closed the door behind them that night, her hands no longer trembled with shock. They trembled with something else, a cold, steady anger that would change everything. Grace did not sleep that night. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, hearing their voices in her head. The people she had raised, fed, and clothed were now speaking to her like strangers. In the quiet of her room, she remembered every late night sewing Ruth's school uniform, every sacrifice she had made so Emmanuel could go to university. Her eyes burned, not with tears, but with the fire of someone who had just learned the true value of trust. The next morning, word had already spread through Mapalo Town. Neighbors smiled at her with knowing glances, and people she barely spoke to before suddenly became friendly. But Grace kept her face calm. She told everyone she hadn't claimed the money yet because she was still processing the shock. In truth, she was giving herself time to think. She visited the lottery office quietly, without telling a soul. She claimed the prize and asked the officer about her options. "It's your money, madam," the man said. "You can keep it, invest it, or give it away." Grace smiled politely, but inside, a seed of a plan began to sprout. Over the next week, Ruth and Emmanuel visited her daily, each time pushing harder for the money. Ruth suggested they could use their share to start a luxury clothing boutique in Cape Town. Emmanuel said he wanted to buy land and build rental apartments. Grace nodded and listened, all the while taking mental notes of their greed. On the 7th day, Emmanuel arrived with a lawyer's card, threatening to take the matter to court. Grace held the card, studied it, and then looked her son in the eyes. "If you want war, my son, I will give you war," she said quietly. Emmanuel laughed, thinking she was bluffing. Grace began moving quietly. She contacted an old friend, Lorato, who was a respected community leader and businesswoman in Mapalo Town. Over tea, Grace told her everything: the trap, the threats, the greed. Lorato listened in silence, her eyes narrowing. "Grace," she said finally, "if they think you're weak, you must show them you are stronger than they ever imagined." With Lorato's help, Grace set up a new business account under the name Unity Wellness Foundation. Publicly, she announced that she was donating a large portion of her winnings to build a free health clinic for the community. Mapalo Town buzzed with excitement. Local radio stations interviewed her. Ruth and Emmanuel, however, were furious. "They're calling you a hero," Emmanuel spat one afternoon, pacing her living room. "You're wasting money that should be ours." Grace folded her arms. "I am using my money for something that will outlive me. What will your boutiques and apartments do for anyone but yourselves?" Ruth tried a softer approach, breaking into tears and accusing Grace of choosing strangers over her own children. Grace's voice was steady. "Children who set traps for their mother are strangers to me." That night, Grace made her final move. She called the police and reported a forged agreement, a fake document Emmanuel had tried to create to claim half the money. By morning, he was summoned for questioning. The whispers in Mapalo Town grew louder, and Ruth stopped showing her face in public. Grace had turned the game around. Mapalo Town was small, and news traveled faster than the wind. Within 2 days, everyone knew Emmanuel had been called to the police station. Some whispered about fraud, others about greed. The shame was heavy, and the respect he once commanded in town began to crumble. Even his friends started crossing the street to avoid being seen with him. Ruth, on the other hand, kept to herself, but her silence spoke volumes. She no longer strutted through town in her designer shoes. Instead, she was spotted at the local market buying the cheapest vegetables, her head wrapped low in a scarf. Grace watched from a distance, not with joy, but with the quiet satisfaction of someone teaching a lesson life would never erase. Meanwhile, the Unity Wellness Foundation gained momentum. Volunteers from nearby towns came to help with the clinic's construction. Businesses donated supplies. Grace, who once walked home unnoticed, now received greetings from children, blessings from elders, and respect from people she had never met. One afternoon, while inspecting the clinic site, Grace overheard 2 young women talking. "Can you imagine? All this because she refused to give in to greed," one said. The other nodded. "It's like something out of the old stories, when the wise woman beats the cunning fox." Grace smiled to herself. She knew her story was becoming a lesson for others. But the battle wasn't entirely over. Emmanuel tried one last desperate move, filing a civil claim in court, insisting he had a verbal agreement with his mother. Grace's lawyer, a sharp woman named Thandi, dismantled his case with precision, presenting evidence of his threats and the fake documents. The judge dismissed the case in less than an hour. When Emmanuel left the courthouse that day, cameras were waiting. Local reporters asked him if he regretted taking his mother to court. His response, a bitter no comment, became the talk of Mapalo Town. Grace didn't need to say a word. The whole community saw the truth for themselves. Ruth, humbled by the public humiliation, came to Grace one evening, tears streaming down her face. She begged for forgiveness. Grace listened in silence, her hands resting on the Bible she kept on the table. "I forgive you," she said softly, "but forgiveness is not the same as trust. Trust must be earned." The clinic was completed 6 months later. On opening day, the entire town gathered. There was music, dancing, and speeches from leaders. Grace stood at the podium in a pale blue dress, her hair wrapped in gold, and spoke with the calm authority of someone who had faced betrayal and turned it into purpose. "As long as I live," she told the crowd, "this clinic will serve every man, woman, and child in Mapalo Town. And let it be known, wealth is not measured by how much you take, but by how much good you leave behind." The applause that followed was thunderous. From that day forward, Grace's name was spoken with respect in every corner of Mapalo Town. Emmanuel left quietly for another city, unable to face the community, and Ruth slowly began rebuilding her relationship with her mother. The trap they had set had failed, and the woman they thought would fall had risen higher than they could ever imagine. Months passed, and the Unity Wellness Clinic became the pride of Mapalo Town. Children came for free checkups, pregnant women received care without worrying about cost, and the elderly no longer had to travel far for treatment. Grace walked through the clinic every morning, greeting patients by name. She had become more than a mother or a businesswoman. She was now a symbol of resilience. One morning, a journalist from Cape Town arrived to interview her. "Your story is spreading," the young woman said, her camera clicking. "People in Johannesburg, Nairobi, even London and Toronto, are sharing it on social media. They're calling you the woman who turned betrayal into a blessing." Grace chuckled softly. "If my story helps even one person stand up for themselves, then it's worth telling." Her phone began ringing with invitations, community events, radio talk shows, even a conference in Canada for African women leaders. Grace had never left South Africa before, but she accepted, determined to share her truth beyond the borders of Mapalo Town. When she stepped on stage in Toronto, dressed in a flowing African print gown, the audience rose to their feet before she even spoke. She told them about the trap that had been set, the greed that had nearly destroyed her, and the choice she made to rise instead of crumble. The hall echoed with applause and tears. Back home, Ruth was slowly mending her life. She began volunteering at the clinic, working with patients and showing a side of herself that Grace hadn't seen in years. Though trust was still fragile, Grace acknowledged her effort. "Change is not in words," she told Ruth. "It is in the work you do every day." Emmanuel, however, remained distant. Pride kept him from returning, but whispers reached Grace that he was struggling in the city. She prayed for him quietly at night. A mother's heart can be wounded, she thought, but it never stops beating for her children. Grace's influence grew far beyond what she imagined. Young women wrote her letters, saying her courage had inspired them to leave abusive relationships, start businesses, or reclaim stolen inheritances. Men, too, approached her, admitting her story had made them rethink the way they treated their families. One day, a group of students from a nearby university invited her to speak at their graduation. Standing on the podium, she told them, "The greatest revenge is not to destroy your enemies, but to build something so strong that their destruction becomes their own doing." The words were shared online, turning into a viral quote. Mapalo Town began to change as well. Inspired by the clinic's success, other residents started community gardens, literacy programs, and small cooperatives. Grace's decision had sparked a wave of self-reliance and generosity that lifted the entire town. Looking out over the hills one evening, Grace felt a deep peace settle over her. She knew the betrayal had been painful, but it had led her to her true calling. In the end, the trap they set for her had become the bridge to her greatest triumph, and that, she thought, was the sweetest revenge of all. The following year, Grace received an unexpected letter. It was from a non-profit organization in the UK that supported women who had survived family betrayal and financial abuse. They wanted to honor her with their Legacy Builder Award in London. Grace was humbled but also curious. She had never thought her story would resonate so deeply beyond South Africa. When she arrived in London, she was struck by the warmth of the reception. The audience was a mix of Africans in the diaspora, British citizens, and people from Canada and the US. As she spoke, she realized that betrayal and resilience were universal experiences. "It doesn't matter where you are from," she said. "The pain is the same, but so is the power to rise again." Her speech was met with a standing ovation. People lined up afterward to share their own stories, some crying, others smiling through tears. A woman from Manchester whispered, "You told my story without even knowing me." "Thank you." Grace held her hand and replied, "That is why we share, so none of us has to feel alone." Back in Mapalo Town, the clinic thrived. Grace had expanded it to include a women's training center, teaching skills from sewing to computer literacy. She believed true healing included both body and mind. The center became a place where people rebuilt their dignity as well as their health. Ruth continued volunteering, slowly regaining the community's respect. One afternoon she approached Grace and said, "I know I can never undo the hurt, but I want to earn your trust, not just ask for it." Grace studied her for a long moment before nodding. "Then we start from here." The townspeople saw the transformation. Once divided, the community began to work together in ways they never had before. Traders donated food for clinic patients, young men helped repair roads leading to the center, and elders offered wisdom during monthly meetings. One evening, Grace received a message from Emmanuel. It was short, "I'm sorry, Ma. I was wrong." Her heart clenched. She didn't respond immediately but prayed over his words. She knew healing would take time, but this was the first step. That same week, the story of Mapalo Town's transformation was featured on a major Canadian news channel. The reporter described it as a place that turned betrayal into a blueprint for community rebirth. Grace's phone buzzed with messages from strangers around the world who wanted to visit and learn from her. It became clear to Grace that her life's work was no longer just about her own family. She was now a custodian of hope, a living example that the worst moments could be rewritten into something beautiful. On the clinic's second anniversary, Grace stood before a crowd of hundreds. Children she had once treated ran around her feet, women she had trained stood proudly in their small business uniforms, and elders blessed her with words of honor. As the sun set behind the hills, she thought, "This is my true inheritance." After the celebration, Grace walked through the quiet corridors of the clinic. The scent of fresh paint from a newly renovated wing lingered in the air. She paused at a photo on the wall, a collage of patients, volunteers, and townspeople, all smiling. In the center was a quote she had once shared at the Canadian conference. "The trap they set for me became the foundation I built on." A gentle knock interrupted her thoughts. Ruth stood at the doorway, holding 2 cups of rooibos tea. "I made this for you," she said softly. Grace accepted it, and for the first time in years, they sat together in silence, not as enemies but as women who had both been shaped by the same storm. The next morning, Emmanuel returned to Mapalo Town. His frame was thinner, his eyes older, but his voice trembled with sincerity. "Ma, if you'll let me, I want to help here." Grace didn't embrace him immediately, but she placed a hand on his shoulder. "If you are ready to work, then you are welcome. The clinic belongs to all who serve it." Months later, Grace looked out from the clinic balcony and saw Ruth teaching young women in the skills center, Emmanuel loading supplies into the clinic van, and children playing in the garden. The town that had once been a place of whispers and betrayal was now alive with laughter, progress, and purpose. That evening, Grace stood under the old acacia tree near her home, the same spot where she had once cried in despair. The air was warm, the sky streaked with gold. She thought of the journey, the heartbreak, the humiliation, the courage it took to stand again. A slow smile spread across her face. They had tried to break her, but she had turned their cruelty into a legacy that would outlive them all. And in that moment, Grace knew. Her revenge was not in their downfall, but in the life she had built beyond them.